We're now going to start preparing the jacket front. What I have here are our panels cut out and our break line is marked with tailor's chalk. Also, I've marked the points on the dart. So what we need to do now is transfer these markings to a means that is more durable than just the chalk. So we're going to tailor's tack. Now a tailor's tack is a running stitch that leaves loops of extra thread. So we're going to start on the break line. So our needle is just in and out. We're just going to leave a long end, then a stitch, and we're going to leave a loop. And then we just carry on this all the way along the break line. Now when we come to do a tailor's tack for a spot, or just a mark of where our darts are, this is a little bit different. So here we want to actually do a stitch. So our needle is going in, we're leaving our long end, and we're actually back tacking, doing a little stitch, and then we leave the loop. And then we'd cut our thread off. So you'd make your little loop for the 4 points of the dart, plus we would run our tacking stitch all the way along the break line. Now also we'd mark with an X the wrong side of the fabric. Now the fabric we're using here, it is very difficult to tell right and wrong side from one another. So if we mark the wrong sides with an X with a tailor's chalk, we know that we're going to be sure to make a pair. So what I have now is a front panel with all our tailor's tacks. Oops, there we go, caught on my zip. So you can see all our loops along the edge there and our loops for our dart. So what we have to do now is gently separate our two layers, and you'll see the fullness of the loop creates our strands in the middle. And then we're just going to snip these threads through the center. Make sure you don't catch any of your fabric. And do this all the way so it leaves our lines there. We do this also on the positions of the darts. As you see, we gently prise it apart. So from the right side, we have transferred all our markings, and they're not going to rub off as the tailor's chalk while we're working with the garment. We're now going to construct the dart on the jacket front. The processes we're covering now correspond with your worksheet number 5. So what I've done here is folded the dart in half, matching up the tailor's tacks. And we're going to sew from the top of the dart down. This is important, especially if you had a fabric with a nap, a pile, that we would sew in the direction of the pile not against it. So we're starting from the top of the dart, working down. We are not going to back tack because we don't want any extra thickness or bulk at the end of the dart. So we're just going to catch gently with our first stitch. If you would prefer, you could mark this line in with a chalk. I'm going to stop with my needle in and then readjust for the angle to the end of the dart. And again, we're not going to back tack, but just do a couple of stitches off at the end of the dart and leave plenty of thread. With the long thread ends we've left at the end of the dart, this means now we can tie off the end of the dart instead of back tacking. So we just literally have the two thread ends together and tie a little knot. Do this a couple of times to make sure it is secure. Then I'm not going to cut the thread ends very close, so I'm just going to leave a little bit of a tail on the end. So we'll do this at both ends of the dart. Once I've tied off the ends of our dart, I've removed the tailor's tacks so they won't be visible on the other side. Then what we have to do is cut through the fold of our dart very carefully. So you need a sharp pair of scissors for this with a nice narrow point, because we need to get as close to the points at either side. Once you've cut through the dart, the allowance of the dart is then pressed open. We're now going to start construction of the welt pocket. The welt pocket is situated on the left-hand side of the jacket as worn, on the chest area, and is at an angle. So what we have here is our actual welt, which has been interfaced with some woven fabric. And we have our squares for our pocket bag, but what we've had to do is create an angle at the top of the pocket bag for when it's in place on the jacket. So what we do here is drop the one corner down by 1.3 centimeters and cut this section off. So we have our angle at the top. So with our first piece of our pocket bag, we're going to place our welt in the center. And then we are going to attach with a 6mm seam. Now we know the toe of the foot, if we were to put this edge to the edge here, is 5mm. So it's just that little bit extra to make it the 6mm. Making sure our raw edges are together. Back tack at the beginning and the end of the row to make sure it's secure. Make sure to trim your thread ends as you go to keep the work neat, and also remembering that my thread is contrast here for you to see it, but you would be working in black because we would work in the colour of the welt, not the colour of the pocketing. We would then press this seam flat and open. When we press our seam open, we also use the edge of the interfacing as a guide and press the interfacing to the front. So again, here, seam allowance pressed open, using the edge of the interfacing as a guide, fold the welt and press into place. What we're able to do now is mark where, if we were to stitch using the interfacing as a guide, down the end of our welt where our stitch would run off to onto the pocketing. I'm going to mark this on both sides. Because what we want to do now is create some volume here in the front of the welt. So this will ensure when we press it, when we turn through, that these seam edges at the sides roll towards the back and we don't see any pocketing. So I can see where I should end up. So I'm just going to move, keeping the fold in the same place. I'm going to just pivot the angle to bring it in by a couple of millimeters. And we're going to stitch at the end of the interfacing as our seam line. So we're going to back tack at the beginning. I'm going to hold this in place. We're going to come down the side of the interfacing to the end of the welt, but we are not going to back tack this edge. Here we're just going to leave our long thread ends, because later on we need to unpick a few stitches here, so we don't want this edge secure. So the same on the other side of the welt. You can see where we align with the pin. I'm just going to bring it forward a couple of mil. Use the interfacing as a guide. Back tack where we are on the fold. To the edge of the welt and stop. No back tack. So we can see now how we have this extra volume here on the welt. So next we have to trim. So I'm going to just cut my thread ends there, leaving these ones in place. Then we're going to cut through the pocket bag, straight across into that last stitch. Then I'm going to fold it out of the way. I'm going to cut up the side of the welt, the seam allowance in half, and then I'm just going to trim a little bit of extra bulk off the corner. So again, on the other side, I'm going to cut the pocket bag straight across to the bottom stitch where we've just attached the welt. I'm tucking it out of the way to make sure I don't catch it. When I trim the seam allowance down by half and some bulk off the corners. We then need to turn our pocket around so we can open up that side seam there of the welt and press that open on both sides. Once that is pressed, we can then turn the welt through. With the jacket front panel, the left-hand side is worn, we've now marked our pocket position. This is at an angle which reflects the angle that we've cut on our pocket bag, which is our 1.3 centimetres. We need to ensure that from the raw edge of our armhole that we come in at least 5 centimetres. This gives us a minimum distance of 3.8 from the armhole, plus our centimetre seam and a 2mm allowance. So we're going to measure and mark our 5. Also on the wrong side of the front, I have tacked into position a piece of pocketing to reinforce this area that we're going to work on and apply in the welt. The actual position of the welt sits about 1.3 to 1.5 centimetres from this raw edge of the pocketing. So we need to make sure that the pocketing covers the whole area of our application of the pocket. So back to the right side. We are now going to attach our welt. So we've turned through and pressed, and you can see that the black edges of the welt are rolling to the wrong side so that the white of the pocketing shouldn't show through. Obviously you could get some black pocketing so that would help with this, but that is why we created that little bit of volume earlier on. So we now then to very carefully unpick our side seams here of the welt back 1 centimetre on both sides. This is why we didn't back tack at the end. You can also see here that we've marked a centimetre seam allowance on our interfacing. We're going to match this centimetre with the chalk mark that we've got here of our pocket position. This means that the welt is being attached on the right side of the jacket and it is upside down, okay? When we attach and turn it through to the wrong side, then it comes the right way up. So we want to make sure we're just catching our welt, not the pocketing. Back tack. I'm doing this by hand because I want to make sure I'm just on that welt and nothing else. Match my line of my centimetre seam allowance with my pocket position line. You can pin and tack if you wish, and we just sew our welt in position. Again, at the end, I'm just going to do a couple of stitches by hand because I don't want to catch that pocket bag, and then back tack and trim our thread ends. So you can see there our first row of stitching. Once all our thread ends are trimmed, we're then going to trim the corner of the welt seam allowance, making sure we don't catch the jacket or the pocketing. So we're just going to trim diagonally across there to reduce bulk. Same on the other side, and trim. So we're now going to attach the other piece of the pocket bag. So we have a diagonal line here, so the highest points go together. Now this tucks underneath the seam allowance of the welt. and we're using the seam allowance edge here as a guide, and we are sewing along this edge. Now this seam should be at least 1 centimetre shorter either end than the seam we've just done. So therefore, where we've trimmed the angle of the corner to reduce the bulk, if I start at this point and stitch to the opposite corner, we should be within our centimetre length to be shorter than our original row. This ensures that this row is not seen when we turn the pocket through. So I'm going to back tack, stitch, using the seam allowance as a guide. As we come to the end, back tack. Again, trim all our thread ends as we go, keeping the book clean. Now the next process is very important you take your time here, because this really affects the finish of the overall pocket. Here we want to cut through this between our 2 rows of stitching through the centre. But we're cutting through our reinforcement of pocketing and our jacket front. So we need to make sure from the other side that we move the seam allowance and the pocketing out of the way. So I'm starting in the centre, and we're just going to snip. And then we're going to work our way to either end. But we need to stop 1 centimetre back at least from our shortest row of stitching. So this is our shortest row of stitching, and I've stopped my cut edge at least 1 centimetre back. I'm going to turn it around. Make sure I'm not catching anything on the other side. And we're going to do the same. So we're going to cut through the middle, stopping at least 1 centimetre short. Now we're going to cut right into that last stitch. We're not going to cut the stitch, but we're going to get as close as we can with a diagonal line. So again, make sure that nothing is being caught behind. And we're going to cut right close into that stitch. Then on the other side, we'll have a longer diagonal, but we cut right into that last stitch. If we don't cut into the last stitch, when you turn it through to the right side, you'll have little pleats and puckers, and the pocket welt won't sit flat. So right into the corner of that last stitch. And again, right into the corner. And if we go past the stitch, we end up with a hole. So it's really worth taking your time to get that right. Then we can push the pocket bag through from the other side. And then you can see then the welt is in the right position. It now sits up. So now we need to press our seam allowances open and to get the pocket bag to lay nice and flat. Once we've pressed or our pocket bag and our seam allowances. We then baste the welt closed. This holds it nice and neat while we continue working with it. So we have to now seal the ends of the welt, because at the moment these are open. In our notes, we've mentioned an oversew. I find this a little bit difficult to do myself, so I'm going to blind stitch mine. So again, bear in mind that we have a yellow thread and you would be working in black. So I'm coming through from the back of the work, right in the fold in the corner of the welt. So what I want to do now is go in directly opposite where I come out on the front of the jacket and take a very small stitch. I then go in opposite on the welt, through the fold of the welt, a small stitch, and come out. Again, in opposite on the jacket front, small stitch, and we come out. If we pull these tight, you'll see the welt will roll over and hide that stitching. But we're going through the fold. The idea of this stitching is that it's invisible. We don't want it to be seen on the finished garment. As I say, colour matching your thread will help immensely here. There we are. So then on the last stitch, I'm going to take this all the way through to the back. And just create a little loop. And we can knot the thread and trim the end. So that will secure the ends of our welt. We now have to join the two sections of our pocket bag. So what I'm going to do here, with the right side facing up, fold the jacket out of the way. Now where we had our reinforcement, our pocketing tacked to the front, I'm unpicking a couple of stitches there because I want to stitch from the top of the reinforcement as close as I can to the end of the actual welt, straight down, turn across and up the other side. So we want to make sure we don't catch our reinforcement. Just moving that a little bit out of the way. Back tack to start, down the side, stop, leaving at least 1 centimetre on the shortest piece, across the bottom. Consider where the edge of our pocket is. If you wish, you can mark this in with a chalk. Needle in as we turn, and we come up the other side, stitching right at the end of the welt onto the reinforcement and back tack. Trim our thread ends, and then we can trim our seam allowance of the pocketing of a pocket bag, but not our reinforcement. I want to keep that as it is, so we can trim our seam allowance to make sure it's nice and even all the way around. There's no need for any overlocking or neatening because our jacket is going to be fully lined and all these raw edges will be enclosed. Just up last side. Again, making sure our reinforcement section is folded out of the way. And there we have our welt pocket completed.